8 days after Hurricane Fiona decided the Maritimes had a few too many trees, NS Power had 27,000 customers without electricity, and Maritime Electric had 22,000 without. Yet as far back as 2011, Maritime Electric's management team has been aware that 51% of their major outage events have been caused by wind and tree contacts, and when you add snow and sleet, that number jumps up to 69%. On top of that, they knew that system hardening or better vegetation management would have prevented many of those outages, but as you'll see throughout this glorified slideshow, their leadership appears to have a habit of waiting until things become a big problem and then charging the customer for the fix. So to start with some context on better vegetation management, here's a comparison of some relevant utilities and how long it takes them to complete a trimming cycle. Central Hudson's is 4.5 years, NB Power is 5 to 7, NS Power is 8 years, and Maritime Electric's is 35. Not 325, that's 35. But to knock that number down to 6 years, Maritime Electric estimates it would now cost around $54 million. Kinda missed the whole ounce of prevention, pound of cure thing, I guess. But they deem that to be too high for customers. Thankfully, though, they do have a 3-step plan to solve their problem. 1. Ask the government to use its forestry workers to do some of their work for them. 2. Create a social media campaign to teach customers how you can do some of their work for them. And 3. Still increase their operating expenditures and pass those costs on to customers via higher prices over the next 3 years, which is the main point of this 391-page general rate application that they sent into Iraq. In addition to that budget increase, Maritime Electric wants to bump its ROE from 9.35 up to 9.95% because the $15.3 million they made last year wasn't enough. Part of their reasoning is that some utilities in North America make more money than them, therefore this increase is, quote, reasonable if not conservative. When it comes to system hardening, though, Maritime Electric actually doesn't want to do that at all. They're claiming they still need time to figure out the best solution, even though they've been under the same ownership since 1994 by a company that specializes in electric and gas utilities, and they've also experienced Hurricane Juan, White Juan, Dorian, and now Fiona. And you need more time. Maybe 35 years like the trim cycle. Meanwhile, who already solved this problem? Musk? No. Bezos? No. It's the city of Summerside, who owns their own utility, Summerside Electric. At least as far back as 2009, they started installing the Hendrix aerial cable system and partially credit it with getting most of the residents' power back 2 days after Fiona passed. Summerside wasn't alone in that choice either, as that cable system has been used for over 40 years due to it heavily reducing outages from tree contacts and adverse weather, the space required to be trimmed around power lines, and the frequency of the trim cycle. Altogether, that can lower operating and maintenance costs, which ends up benefiting the shareholders ultimately. In the case of Summerside Electric, that's the city and its residents. Maritime Electric, though, as I mentioned before, is instead looking to raise their operating budget for vegetation management, even though over just the last 3 years they generated around $44 million in returns for their owner, Fortis Incorporated. That's $44 million not invested in improving their grid, vegetation management, or the next issue, hiring an appropriate amount of staff. If you subtract the board of directors and executives from the total staff count and divide that number into the customer base and length of all the power lines in each grid, you can get a rough picture of how many customers and kilometers of power line each employee has to cover. Shout out to anybody that learned math when they were a kid with those yellow blocks. NB Power's ratio is 1 employee per 154 customers and 10 kilometers of power line. NS Power is 1 per 264 customers and 16 kilometers. And Maritime Electric is 1 employee per 476 customers and, reoccurring number, 35 kilometers of power line. During normal operating conditions, utilities might be able to get away with skimping on staff, but when it comes to hurricanes or that incredibly rare event called winter, that small pool of staff can quickly become overwhelmed by the amount of calls for outages, lines that need to be fixed, and trees that need removing. Along with keeping a reasonable vegetation management cycle and system hardening where it makes sense, properly staffing a utility is a key factor in keeping its grid up and running. Given that all 3 utilities are regulated by agencies with similar powers whose members are appointed by government but operate at arm's length from them, or are supposed to, why is there such a difference in the outcomes? Is it simply because NB Power is publicly owned, whereas NS Power is owned by Emera, who holds its customers hostage if its profits are threatened, and Maritime Electric is owned by Fortis, the billion-dollar company that appears to skimp on its taxes? Maybe. Looking at it through an economics lens, though, it does become a little bit more clear. With a natural monopoly like a utility, misaligned incentives between customers and shareholders become much more pronounced. In a competitive market, firms are pressured to compete with one another, often leading to lower prices, better quality products or services, operating efficiencies, etc., etc. So, with no competitive pressure, a private utility's main incentive is just to maximize returns for its shareholders. With a public utility, though, the shareholders of the province or city in the case of Summerside, and ultimately their voters, thereby aligning the incentives of both parties as they're one and the same. Now, is it a little more complicated than that? Yes, of course. There's a mountain of econ literature out there covering the matter, but hopefully this video shed at least some light on public versus private utilities, along with Maritime Electric's lengthy response to Hurricane Fiona. And if you've stuck around this far, feel free to pop a squat on that subscribe button, as I've got another video in the works about how PEI's poor zoning regulations are impacting everything from you finding a place to rent to how much tax property owners have to pay. Or don't. Either way, thanks for watching.